Hey, it's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up again with the Cold War, Unit 11. And we're going to start with Lesson 4, Eisenhower and the Cold War. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Truman's idea of what to do with Russia or with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which was containment. And what we're going to do is look at Eisenhower and what was his approach. So we had the Democrat Truman. Now we're going to look at the Republican in terms of what his ideas were in terms of containing the Soviet Union. Now, understand something. Eisenhower's an old military guy, and a lot of Americans were very, very comfortable with him being president during this period because of the fact that he had all this military experience. What we'll do, of course, is pick up with the unit focus questions, and as we said with the unit focus questions, we do not answer those at the end of the lesson. We will at the end of the unit. This is what effect did the Cold War have on the United States and its relationship with other nations around the world? And number 2, describe American prosperity during the post-WWII period. Vocabulary, okay, we have 2 types of vocabulary that we will address. We have the academic vocabulary, of course, and content vocabulary. We'll address as many of these, of course, as we can as we go through the lesson, but we always tell you to take out your journal and write these terms down and define them yourself because you can better get a greater understanding about what we're talking about if you understand what those terms, of course, mean. All right, lesson focus question. Unlike the unit focus question, the lesson focus questions we will address, of course, at the end of this particular lesson. The first question is what policies were created by President Eisenhower to prevent the spread of communism? And number 2, what role did the spying have on the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union? Now, what we're going to do, of course, is start with the do now activity. Take out your journals, as we always tell you, write down this particular topic, and what it says is Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, made a speech called A Rise to Globalism and made the statement that you have to take chances for peace, just as you take chances in war. What sentiment does Dulles express with that statement? Go ahead, take a few moments and think about it, and we'll be back in a few moments and see what you found. Well, when you look at that statement by Dulles, what he's basically saying when he makes this statement, you have to take chances for peace just as you take chances in war. What he's saying is this here, fortune favors the bold. In other words, you have to do what you have to do, of course, to see about achieving your goals. And whether that means that you have to step out of your comfort zone and cooperate with somebody that you're not necessarily that keen on, but you do what you have to do, of course, for the end result. So when you look at John Foster Dulles and you look at Eisenhower, what they're basically saying is that we will do whatever we have to do to ensure that we have peace, even if that means that we have to threaten and go to the very edge of war to prevent war. And that policy that comes out is going to be called brinkmanship, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, what we're going to start with is Eisenhower become president. Remember now, Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander during World War II of the Allied forces, and Americans are very comfortable with him as being the president of the United States of America starting in 1952 because of that experience. In 1952, Truman failed to run for president because he didn't think he could win. Democrats chose Adlai Stevenson, who lost in a landslide to Dwight Eisenhower, the former Allied commander in Europe during World War II. Many Americans believed that Eisenhower's military leadership and expertise could contain communism and provide security to citizens, and that was the #1 thing. Security. That's what most Americans wanted in this nuclear age or atomic age where they were afraid, and they were afraid, of course, of communists, and they felt like that Eisenhower was the next best, or the best opportunity that they had, of course, to protect themselves. The campaign slogan for Eisenhower in 52 was "I like Ike," and that's the reason why a lot of them liked Ike. Eisenhower continued containment, but reduced the size of the military by increasing nuclear weapons production. The idea was to threaten aggressors with massive retaliation. However, Eisenhower also promoted American economic prosperity to deter the spread of communism at home in America. Eisenhower understood that there had to be peace through strength. Now, in his mind, the strength didn't come from a conventional military. The military actually shrinks during Eisenhower, but when we look at the creation of atomic weapons, it increases during Eisenhower's time as President of the United States of America. Brinkmanship. Now, we told you about that policy of doing whatever you had to do, of course, to ensure that you keep the peace, even if you have to go to the very edge of war. And that policy created by Dulles, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, and Eisenhower was called brinkmanship. Eisenhower rejected the use of limited wars to contain communism. He wasn't a fan of what happened in Korea. He didn't believe in fighting, limited wars. If you want to fight, it was going to be a fight. It wasn't going to be something on a small scale. So he rejected the use of limited wars to contain communism. Instead, he created the policy of brinkmanship, which relied on America's nuclear arsenal as a deterrent to communism. Under the policy, the United States would threaten the use of nuclear war and would be committed to the use of nuclear weapons by going up to the absolute verge of war. Brinkmanship was used in Taiwan to prevent the communists from taking over the nationalist government and in Egypt to prevent the spread of Soviet influence and the threat of Soviet bombing in Britain and France. So when you look at Eisenhower's plan, what he's simply saying is this here: we have an atomic weapon and we don't mind using it to achieve our goals, or at least we don't mind using the threat of it to achieve our foreign policy goals. Cold War spying. The start of the large-scale spying and the creation of spy networks was created during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was trying to get an edge, and the best way to get an edge, of course, is to spy and see what the other ones have. The arms race and the desire to create an advantage between the two nations led to the space race, a race that the U.S. recognized it was behind when the Soviets launched the first artificial satellite into space called Sputnik. Now, when Sputnik was sent into space, one of the things that Americans recognized for the first time that in technology, the United States of America was behind the Soviet Union. So if we were behind in technology when it comes to the space race, could it be that we could possibly be behind the Soviet Union when it comes to missile technology and atomic or nuclear technology? And that was a huge fear on the side of most Americans. And in order to kind of combat that, when the United States of America created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, to win the space race to the stars. Covert spy operations were used by the United States in Iran and Guatemala to install leaders favorable to the United States in Eastern Europe to destabilize Soviet influence after the death of Stalin in 1953 and the ascent to power of Nikita Khrushchev. So in other words, the United States of America, once again, do whatever we have to do, cozy up to whatever dictator or whatever government that opposed communism we had to prevent the spread of communism, especially into the Western Hemisphere or into what we would call Canada, the United States, Central America, and South America. Here's a picture of one of those intercontinental ballistic missiles. And one of the things, the reason why the intercontinental ballistic missile was so important is because the United States of America could take these missiles and put them in sites in our NATO partners or alliance members. We could put them in Europe on the border of the Soviet Union, and it gave us a strategic advantage. And we're going to find that the Soviets are going to try to do the same thing in Cuba to gain a strategic advantage for them. So it leads to problems. Here's a picture of that Sputnik satellite that was launched by Russia that started the space race. Here is a symbol for the National Aeronautics Space Administration, or NASA. The Eisenhower Doctrine. One of the things that we want to understand about what a doctrine is a plan of action. In terms of looking at Eisenhower's plan of action or his doctrine, it committed the U.S. military or economic aid to any nation in the Middle East that was trying to resist the communist threat posed by the Soviets and their puppet Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Efforts by Eisenhower and Khrushchev to settle tensions between the two nations never happened when a summit between the two was canceled when an American U-2 plane was shot down in 1960. In other words, it's here. The United States of America used the Eisenhower Doctrine just like Truman used the Truman Doctrine, of course, to prevent the spread of communism or to keep it in its existing borders. And if that meant that we had to give economic aid to a country, we would. If it meant that we had to threaten a country, we would. We would do whatever we had to do, of course, to ensure that America's interests, of course, were served. And when we look at the Middle East, the one thing the United States of America was dependent on that came from the Middle East, of course, was oil. And we didn't want the Soviets and Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt, to be responsible for controlling the oil in the Middle East, because that would adversely affect Americans at the gas pump. Here's a picture of Francis Gary Powers. He was the American pilot that was shot down. He was a CIA operative that was shot down over the Soviet Union, taking pictures of Soviet missile bases. It's kind of crazy about Francis Gary Powers. He was in a Soviet jail for 21 months or so, about 21 months. He was released and then lived a good life, of course, up until 1977, where he is a helicopter pilot for NBC, I think KNBC in Ohio, and shot down from 70,000 feet or 60,000 feet in a U-2 spy plane, and he gets killed in a helicopter crash. Now that's some crazy kind of thoughts that kind of go through your mind. That's kind of freaky to think about that way. Here's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt that a lot of people feared because of his popularity that he could take over and establish one Middle East, one Arab country to be united. And they felt that he had the political influence and the popularity to establish an Arab nation of all Arab nations. And he was a puppet for the Soviet Union, which means that he directly was against American interests. At this time, we'll look at an activity on brinkmanship. So we will pause the presentation and allow you time to copy the activity on brinkmanship. Once you have completed the activity, you should turn it into your teacher to be graded. Good luck, and we will see you in a bit to review your answers. So at this time, go ahead and write down and copy the brinkmanship activity. And once you've done that, we'll give you a little time to formulate what your answers are. Now that you've completed the activity on brinkmanship, we will look at your answer key and give you a few insights. The key has been included in the lesson to give you more detailed answers to the activity once you've turned it in, of course, to your teacher. But in looking at the effectiveness of brinkmanship, it says brinkmanship was effective in several instances, notably during the 53 Korean armistice negotiation, the 62 Cuban Missile Crisis, and then in 56 the Suez Crisis. And when we look down at the impact on alliances, what we can say very simply is this: brinkmanship altered the U.S. relationships by fostering a sense of solidarity among NATO allies who shared the threat of communism, but also created tension when some allies disagreed with aggressive tactics. For adversaries, it heightened the perception of the U.S. resolve, leading to both caution and retaliatory strategies as nations recalibrated their approaches based on perceived intentions. All right, lesson focus questions. We have 2 lesson focus questions for Unit 11. Lesson number 4, what policies were created by President Eisenhower to prevent the spread of communism? And what role did spying have on the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union? Well, when you look at it, what policy was created by the President Eisenhower to prevent the spread of communism is called massive retaliation, brinkmanship, the use of covert operations, and the Eisenhower Doctrine were the key components of Eisenhower's plan. And what role does spying have on the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union? Well, I think that's common sense. Both nations created these large spy networks to destabilize each other and gain advantageous weapons technology and locate targets for influence and install leaders favorable to their ideology. And this, of course, caused a lot of mistrust and a lot of dislike, of course, between the 2 countries. All right. Once again, this is the end of Lesson 4, Unit 11, the Cold War. This is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. And do what we always tell you now. Don't take my word for it. Do your own research, reach your own conclusions. And with that, we'll see you next time.